Hey, I'm making this video. Oh, is it starting now? I'm making this video because I had a class called Performance Theory where we had to read this wonderful book called Morphology of the Folktale. And I found out there's like almost nothing on YouTube about this book, even though it's good and important and stuff. And it really pissed me off, so like I'm making a video now to tell you about this book. So Morphology of the Folktale, it's really good. It's basically about what it says on the title. It's, this guy took, his name is, wow, I'm forgetting. His name is Prop, last name. Basically the idea was he wanted to see, like, what's really going on with folktales. Like, what are the commonalities, stuff like that. This is, it's very similar to, like, Hero with a Thousand Faces sort of stuff, but, like, way better, trust me. So Prop invented basically this type of analysis that he would do on different genres of story. So first of all, you have to define a genre before you can do this analysis. And genre definitions for Prop are completely arbitrary. You can define the genre however you'd like. So Prop defined his genre. This is the original use of the method. His genre was Russian folktales. Now, I think it would almost be difficult for him to have picked like a worse genre to be doing this analysis on, because I care about a lot of boring stuff, but I could not give like half a shit about Russian folktales, and I tried really hard. So a couple of other things he has going against him. So Prop was writing in the 1920s at the beginning of the Soviet Union, so not a lot of people outside of the Soviet Union got to hear from him right away. Mostly his influence was on like Eastern European thinkers, people within the Soviet bloc. The other problem he had is that Joseph Campbell came along and wrote A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and as soon as you tell people about this book, they think like, oh, it's the same thing, somebody's already done that, but they haven't. Prop's thing is really different. So Propian analysis, what is it and how does it work? So first of all, you have to define the genre. As I've said, that's you do that completely arbitrarily. Second, you need to define key functions of that genre. So a function is basically any one sentence description of an action or a state of being that exists in that genre. I'm gonna come walk over here because it'll balance out the composition throughout the video. So a genre is basically defined arbitrarily, and you need to come up with what the functions are. Went off screen for a bit. What the functions are that are essential to that genre. So for example, in Russian folktales, one of the essential functions would be, for example, like the hero goes on a journey. That pretty much has to happen. If that doesn't happen, you don't have a Russian folktale. So Prop, it's a pretty long book. It's about 120 pages long. About 80 of these pages are just dedicated to him talking about the various functions. So if you decide that you want to read it, you should skip that bit because it's really boring. I read every page. It was not worth it. Just skip it. Don't do it. So yeah, that's Propian analysis. And the thing is, Prop himself is pretty boring, but the analysis that he came up with is quite useful. And I'm going to prove it by making reference to another book, if I haven't lost it, called Sixguns and Society. So this is written by a guy named Will Wright, who, this book, much better than this one. So basically he took Prop's analytic style and he applied it to a genre that, people actually can be bothered to give a shit about, which is Western films. So like I said, genre is defined more or less arbitrarily, but Will Wright went out of his way to define his genre clearly and with a reason behind it. He didn't just pick out some movies and write about those. So what Will Wright is trying to do here is he's trying to figure out what's going on under the hood of Western movies. Why do we enjoy these movies? What is it about them that appeals to American society? And so in pursuing that goal, he couldn't just pick any old Western movies, right? He had to pick Western movies that actually did well, that people actually cared about, that people actually went out to see. So he basically picked a range of movies that were that had the most return on investment between, I think the years were like 1930s to 1970s. And then he did the Propian analysis on those. So we're gonna get to the results in a second, but I have to talk about boring stuff a little bit more. Just a sec, I have presentation notes. Okay, so one of the things that's really frustrating about prop, that I'm holding it upside down, but one of the things that's really frustrating about prop that while I was reading the book struck me is that, you know, he had a very interesting methodology, and he did spend some time kind of thinking about what his results meant. So one of the most striking things that Prop discovered about Russian folktales is that they're really quite limited in terms of, you know, what will happen. Like structurally, if you look at these folktales, you can see like, oh, well, if X happens, then either A, B, or C is going to happen, and it's always one of those three. You know, those aren't for reasons of coherence. That's not because A, B, and C are the only possible things that could happen. You know, you could equally have a story where, you know, Z happens, or where L happens. I'm not giving specific examples because I don't remember anything about any Russian folktale ever. But the point is that there's certain stories that just don't get told, even though they make sense. So the question that comes to mind immediately is why? Why are there stories that people just won't tell each other, that just don't make it into the canon of Russian folktales? And you know what's frustrating is that Prop acknowledges that question and then just doesn't even make any like gesture towards answering it. He just throws it out there and then leaves it for you. He doesn't say anything. He mentions like, well, I guess it might have something to do with the structure of the human mind. It might just be that people are not very creative, not as creative as they think they are, etc., etc. And then he says nothing. So Prop comes again and again. It's called a morphology of the folktale, and Prop takes that word morphology very seriously, because basically almost any time that there's something interesting to be said about his results, Prop just falls back on this whole line of, well, I'm just a morphologist, so I'm not really positioned to answer those sorts of questions. So yeah, it's really frustrating that he does that. Can you tell that I was frustrated reading this book? It's really long, and well, it's not that long, but it's really boring. Even though the ideas are really important. So what's nice about this is that Will Wright doesn't do that. He actually does the structural analysis, looks at the results, and then says, okay, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for Westerns? And more importantly, like, what does this mean for society? Thusly the name, Sixguns in Society. Will Wright's book is about 200 pages long, and if he had only done what Prop did, he would have finished 80 pages before that. So he does a lot more. He goes into like, what does this mean for society, and that's really helpful. By the way, if you're doing any sort of like research on genre, narrative function, if you're a writer, you really ought to read Prop, and you really ought to read some of the stuff that was inspired by him, even though it's a little bit obscure. Kind of side tangent, but I actually use this book to as like fodder for short fiction, and it's really useful to understand kind of the genre conventions of a genre that you're working within, even if as I did, you're only learning those conventions so that you can break them in the most interesting way that you can imagine. So yeah, it's worth knowing what the rules are, even if you plan to break them anyway. Okay, so before I go into more depth about Sixguns in Society, we need to talk a little bit about like stories in general. It's useful before we kind of zoom in to the specifics of Westerns to think about just like what a story is, what they're for. So yeah, like what's like the point of a story? You know, that's an important question. And Will Wright actually goes out of his way to ask and make some gestures towards answering it. You know, at the end of the day, it's not really the point of the book, but he does talk about it in there. So the first thing he says is that this question of like, why do human beings tell stories? It might be kind of a mirage, kind of an illusion almost, because of what he terms the inherency of the narrative genre. So the example he gives is, if you have let's say you have a car, okay, and you lend me the car, and I bring it back to you, and the bumper isn't there anymore. Like the bumper of the car, it's gone. And you ask me, well, how come there's no bumper on my car? That's not cool. My answer is necessarily going to take the form of a story. I'll give you a story where at the beginning of the story, your car had a bumper. At the end of the story, your car doesn't have a bumper. And then presumably whatever I put in the middle, that's the answer for you. That's the explanation of why your car doesn't have a bumper anymore. And there's no other way to explain it. Like, I mean, you can try, but there's no other way to explain one human to another why something happened or what something means, except for telling them a story about it. That's all we have. So he also talks about stories as practice for interpreting real life. So this is kind of, yeah, he also talks about stories as practice for interpreting real life. So this is the situation that we're in. When you read a story, you're basically kind of trying to figure out what's happening next, even if you're not actively attempting to do so. You see elements in the story and you think to yourself, what does this mean? What does it mean is going to happen? And then later in the story, those questions are answered, and you get your answer finally to the question of what's going to happen. So stories are basically, practice, so that you can kind of like get used to the idea of like A means B means C, and then when you go out into the world and you see, okay, A, you know that B and C are going to happen next. So these show up time and time again as like story motifs. It's not as direct as like, because some stories are very fantastical. So for example, like a Russian folktale, if you run into an old lady with wooden teeth, well, you're not going to run into an old lady with wooden teeth. That's probably not going to happen to you. So these messages aren't communicated at the level of literal like if A then B then C. It's more about like, okay, well, if you meet a lady with a wooden teeth, then she's probably a witch. Okay, so that's communicating to you roughly that you should trust your instincts about creepy, weird strangers, and you shouldn't trust them. You should, if you have a feeling that someone might want to do you harm, you should trust that feeling. So that's the sort of thing that I mean when I say that stories are practice for interpreting real life. So Will Wright also talks about stories as kind of entertainment. And what he says about this, it's connected to stories as a practice for interpreting real life. So what he says about this is that there's kind of a right amount that you want to be surprised. Being surprised is supposed to be a good thing in stories. And if a story is predictable, you're not going to want to want to read it. If you read page 1 and you know what happens by the end, then you're not going to want to read that story. But at the same time, if a story is just completely unpredictable, you're not going to want to read it either. A story where you can't even predict what the next sentence might be, where on page 1 something happens and then on page 2 something completely unrelated happens. That's not a good story either. And so his argument here is that because stories are practice for interpreting real life, we need stories that are coherent but that surprise us in important ways. We need stories where they're a little tricky, the kinds of stories that we like. We get surprised, but ultimately the framework that we have for interpreting reality isn't fundamentally challenged or isn't like completely swept away. Those kinds of stories we really don't like. So that's what I have to say on the level of surprise that's useful within a story. The last thing he says, and he harps on this point quite a bit, is that stories are the most, they're as full of meaning as they possibly can be. So Will talks a couple of times, actually, he harps on about it a little bit, if you ask me, about how when he was young, he would wonder, why is it that when his friends cough, like cough, he doesn't worry about them? You know, just that guy's coughing. But in a movie, if someone coughs, that means probably that they're going to die. That means they're ill with some sort of disease, and they're going to have to deal with that in some way. So why is it, if stories are supposed to be practice for interpreting real life, why is it that they don't mirror real life? And the answer is because every element in a story is supposed to be intentional. If something happens, in a story, there's some sort of interpretation that's going on there. There's something to be gleaned from that, right? So, Will was writing in about the Will was writing in the 1970s. So he had to deal a little bit with this kind of, these types of movies that will just throw out random things and then not explain them very well. But he didn't deal a lot with them. So nowadays we have movies that will throw out some detail that then turns out to be meaningless. So this isn't just red herrings, because red herrings actually do mean something. They're kind of an attempt to get you to look over here, and then actually the action's going on over here. What Will is saying that there aren't a lot of in movies are things where the movie throws something out, and you're just supposed to go, oh, well, I guess that happened. And he's right, that's pretty uncommon, but it's getting more common. Partially, I would argue, it'd be interesting if we could talk to the guy and see what his opinion is on this development in filmmaking. Partially, I think that exists as a way to, as a reaction against the idea that movies are supposed to be maximally meaningful. Why can't we have a movie where someone says something and it just doesn't mean anything? Things like that. Yeah, so those are all kind of vague gestures that he makes toward answering the question of why stories are meaningful. In the end, none of them is quite a full explanation, but they do get us kind of a bit closer to the answer. And I think we've learned quite a bit about storytelling along the way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about differences between the analysis used by Will Wright and used by the boring prop guy. So prop's idea, to reiterate from 10, however many minutes ago, is that, so step 1, you define a genre. Step 2, you define core narrative functions. All right, so a hero goes out on a journey. This just theoretical example. So a function could be a hero goes out on a journey. The hero meets a fine maiden or whatever. And the hero has to fight a dragon. The dragon is very strong. So those sorts of things, where you're describing just one state about the world or one kind of occurrence. And these aren't just descriptions of things that happen in individual movies. These are descriptions of things that happen in every example from your entire genre. So you're trying to basically come up with a list. The most stripped down explanation of a story. So imagine a friend. You go to a movie with them, and you fall asleep halfway through. And when you wake up, you say, "Hey, buddy, what happened?" And they say, "Oh, the good guys fought the bad guys, and then the good guys won by outsmarting them." That's not a good description of the movie, because you kind of already knew that was gonna happen, probably. So what you're trying to do in Propian analysis is you're trying to produce a list of descriptors that would describe everything from that entire genre. So that's basically Propian analysis. It's very useful for if you're comparing types of genres, or if you're trying to figure out what the narrative core of the genre is, or, as I mentioned before, if you're trying to invent something completely new. If you're trying to say, I want to write a folktale that it's not like any other folktale, then Propian analysis can help you, because it can tell you what the similarities are between every other folktale, and then you're able to just break those rules. All right. So already we have a pretty strong set of bones. So, but Will Wright goes on to add to that in his analysis. So the first thing he adds is the concept of a narrative sequence. So this goes back to his idea about narrative as an inherently explanatory genre. Okay, so let's go back to the example of me breaking your car. So step one, A, is your car is not broken. C is your car is broken. And then B, whatever it is, we're going to assume that's the explanation for how we got from A to C. So A, B, C, and then B is inherently the explanation, even if I don't like firmly connect, I don't firmly like explain why those are connected. So for example, if you say, why is my car broken? And I say, well, there was a discount on wine at the grocery store. You know, that's not a direct explanation of how your car got broken. But because it's sitting between your car is not broken and your car is broken, we can kind of intuit that A leads to B leads to C. So Will Wright calls these narrative sequences. So, okay, narrative sequences are a little bit more specific than that. So narrative sequences are a little bit more specific than that. A narrative sequence is any situation in a genre where if one thing happens, you know what's going to happen next, and you know what's going to happen after that. So one narrative sequence that he singles out in Westerns is, for example, in classical Westerns, he singles out the hero comes to town as the beginning of the narrative sequence that he calls fighting. So the hero comes to town, and he encounters the villains. The villains threaten a friend of the hero in some way, and then the hero is forced into a confrontation with them, he has to fight them, and ultimately he defeats them. So if the first thing happens, the second thing has to happen. Otherwise, well, the second thing always happens. Not necessarily that it has to, but it always does. And then the third thing always happens, and then the fourth thing always happens. These don't necessarily have to come in order. So for example, your narrative sequence could just be the hero meets a fine maiden, and then the next item in the sequence is the hero and the maiden get married. That's a very like folktale-y sort of thing. So those aren't necessarily right next to each other, but they do form a narrative sequence nonetheless. The other thing he adds is the concept of a subtype. So Will's problem with doing this analysis was that, you know, Western movies, even though they're all quite similar, are actually, they have some key similarities, key differences, sorry. They're not really as similar as, for example, Russian folktales are. So what Will does is he divides them into similar sorts of plot structures. So in a sense, instead of doing one analysis, he does 4 of them separately. And that helps him to figure out what exactly it is that these things mean for American society. Because at the end of the day, he doesn't care just about Western movies, even though they're really cool, pow pow. He cares about meaning, and why is it that Americans at this time wanted to see these movies. And ultimately, his answer is, skipping ahead a little bit, ultimately his answer is that these movies, in an indirect way, answer questions that people have about their lives. Yeah, we'll get to that. But anyway, essentially, he breaks them up into 4 different structures, and he acknowledges that the structures have different, they rise and fall in different time periods. So the first one is a classical Western. We'll get into what makes a classic, but what you need to know is that these were originally, they were kind of at their height during the 1930s to about the 1950s, and then the Vengeance Western comes next. So it basically is what it sounds like, where someone's main goal in the movie is to get revenge. That comes a little bit later. And then for a very brief time, you have something called a transitional Western. We'll talk about those. They're super weird. It basically represents a rejection of the previous forms that had come before. The reason that these movies are so hard to classify, transitional Westerns in particular, is because they're basically, the plot structure is so incoherent because we're in a period where we've rejected the old structures, but we haven't found a new structure to latch onto. And then the fourth one, that new structure that eventually arises, is the professional Western, which honestly is a pretty depressing answer to the transitional Western, if you ask me. We'll get to what all those things mean in a second. I need to look at my notes again. Okay, so we're going to talk about a boring old dead dude called Levi-Strauss. So I like Levi-Strauss quite a bit, but I haven't read enough of his work to really give you an adequate explanation of structural analysis. But basically, if you just chain the lineage together, so Wright is the son, Prop is the dad, Levi-Strauss is the granddad. So he's the one who came up with the ideas that inspired Prop, which eventually inspired Will Wright to write the book that was actually good, instead of all those ones that were interesting but not really very, very good. So Levi-Strauss came up with the idea of binary oppositions. So Levi-Strauss thought that this was key to human thought, that you have one thing over here, and necessarily there's an opposite thing. Okay, so he thought that basically the only way the human mind works is by constructing these binaries, where you have good and bad. Basically anything that you can think of, you can immediately think of its opposite. And so he thought that this was an important part of myth-making and just, human understanding in general. So Will Wright builds on this in an interesting way, in that he has trinary opposition. So there's three items. So instead of having, you have good over here and you have bad over here, what you have is, so you still have good and bad, but instead of them constituting categories of their own, they're kind of spaces that get moved through. So an example of the Western, an example from the Western. So there's three main entities in a Western. There's the heroes, the bad guys, and society. The heroes are always separate from society, the villains are always separate from society, and then society is its own separate entity. So in a classic Western, you have the concepts of good and bad, right? And so the bad guys are obviously bad. It's in the name. And the good guy, the hero, is obviously good. And then in the classic Western, society is, with the hero, good. So in different forms, you have different versions of these. So Wright identifies four different divisions like that are important to Westerns. So society and outside society. So in the classic, your hero is inside. In the classic Western, your hero is outside society, and the villains are outside society, and obviously society is inside society. Good and bad, we already went over that. Strong and weak. The villains are strong, the hero is strong, society is weak. And then you have wilderness and civilization, where the hero is a part of wilderness, the villains are usually a part of I forget that one, but and then society is obviously a part of civilization. Will's distinction between society and civilization, you'll notice those were on two separate oppositions. So his division there is it's a little bit technical, but basically the idea is civilization is being fancy, drinking tea and stuff, and society is being a part of living with other people, the boring stuff. So what this allows Will to do, what this lets you do in the story, is that it allows you to create a situation where each entity has a core, an important similarity with each other entity and an important difference, if that makes sense. So the hero is good, and in that sense he shares a similarity with society. Society is also good, and he's unlike the villains. But the villains are a part of the wilderness, and in that sense they have a connection to the hero, and society is not a part of the wilderness. So you see, it allows for these kind of conflicts of interest, where you take entities and you say, okay, well, these ones share this similarity because they're both a part of this category. These ones share this similarity because they're both a part of this category. It lets you characterize any like entity in a story very very clearly. So yeah, that's his main contribution to Levi-Strauss's idea of binary oppositions. Okay, so we should look at his actual results for a second. This is the part that is just going to be about Westerns. So, like I said earlier, the point of Propian analysis, you're supposed to produce basically a list of the barest bones description of a genre that that applies to any iteration in that genre. And Wright does produce some lists. I have them right here. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all of them because that would be kind of boring. Instead, I'll like post the links, post the list in the description or in the comments or something. And by the way, I do encourage you to actually read through them, because if you've watched like any Western film, you're going to see basically a description of that film in this list. Okay, so first I'll give like a brief description of each one. Okay, so in the classic plot, what happens is you have a hero who is not a part of society. He enters society but is not fully accepted by it. And then the villains come along and they threaten society. At first, the hero doesn't want to get involved. He wants to stay apart from society. But eventually the villains threaten someone who's important to the hero. So he comes back and he defeats them. That's how every classic plot goes, with very few deviations. So what's the message there? You know, what's the message? So there's two things. One is that being separate from society makes you strong, but joining society is ultimately worth it, worth sacrificing your strength. So that's the message of the classic plot. Yeah. Okay, so then you have the vengeance variation. All right, what's different about the vengeance variation? The hero starts inside society, so he's not outside of society. It's a different category. He starts inside of society. The villains come and they do something bad to the hero. So they like kill their family, something. The hero, goes out to kill the villains. But first, in order to become strong, they have to leave society in some important way. So again, we have this motif of being a part of society makes you weak. Being separate from society makes you strong. And that's a very common theme in these Westerns. In fact, it's universal. So the hero leaves society in order to get revenge on the villains. Eventually, a representative of society convinces the hero that they need to give up on their revenge, and they need to return to society. Usually, that representative of society is, it's a hot lady. In one movie, I think it's a priest, but always someone from society convinces the hero to give up their revenge plot. There's an interesting feature here that Will Wright doesn't talk about. And I think it's interesting to mull over. I haven't quite figured it out what it means myself, which is that in a lot of these movies, the hero gives up on, I don't know what this means, but the hero gives up on revenge, but the villains die anyway. Something happens to them. So if you've seen the movie The Revenant, this is a modern version where Leonardo DiCaprio is like chasing a guy who killed his son, and he chases him all the way across the wilderness. He's finally got him. He's like shot him like 4 times. It's movie magic how they're still alive. And he's like got him by the scruff of the neck, and he's gonna like chop his head off or something. And then he like looks up and he sees the like ghost of his wife or something. I forget what he sees. I fell asleep during the movie in the middle bit. He sees like the ghost of his wife or something, and she says like, "No, revenge isn't worth it. Don't turn to the dark side, Luke." And then he takes this bastard who's killed his son, and instead of like cutting his head off, there's a river behind him. He just throws him in the river, and he's like given up on killing him, and that's it. So in that sense, he's rejected his revenge, and he's decided at the behest of his dead wife's ghost that he's gonna return to society. one interesting twist on that particular movie is that his wife is Native American. So they're doing something kind of clever here, which is that in a lot of traditional westerns, they have the racist trope of like representing wilderness with Native Americans. So in this case, they reverse it, which is I think a pretty clever trick. You see, doing this sort of analysis helps you write better movies. So anyway, he throws the guy into the river, and the guy's like, no, and like swims away. And downriver, we see that a like band of Native Americans has been tracking the guy as well, and they like jump in the river and pull him out and stab him to death and throw him back in the river. So I don't know what it means, but basically Leonardo DiCaprio gets to have his cake and eat it too. He gives up his revenge and says, no, I'm returning to society. This isn't worth it for me. But the person he wants to kill dies anyway. I don't know. If you have any theories on what that means for like this genre, leave them in the comments because I honestly want to know. And that's very common in these revenge plots. Okay, so 2 out of 4. So the transitional theme, which became more popular in around the 70s, is really weird. It's really strange, and if you've read the list down there, you'll notice that there isn't a plot list for transitional themes. That's because they're really weird, and you can't. There's only like 4 of them that he identifies, and you can't put them. You can't nail them down. They're all so different that it was just impossible for him to create a Propian analysis style list. So what are they? Like what binds them together? So at the beginning of the book, he does acknowledge that to some extent the reason that he put transitional plots all in a category of their own is because they're different. They're the ones that he couldn't classify, so he wasn't really sure what's going on there. But he argues there is still not necessarily a structural similarity, but a thematic similarity that ties them together, and that is that they're effectively a rejection of the classical plot. So one example of a transitional theme, I'll just go through a specific movie so you can get the idea of what sort of rejection it is, follows a man whose wife is, I believe, Native American. It's been a while since I read the book, but his wife is Native American, and there's a war with her tribe, right? And so the settlers in the village where these people live decide that obviously means that his wife has to die. So it starts out kind of like a revenge, like a strange style like revenge Western, where instead of getting revenge on villains who come from outside of society and do bad to the hero, the hero seems like they're going to get revenge on society itself, because it's society that killed the guy's wife, and not some like external, faraway like bandits or something. So it seems like at first it seems like it's an interesting take on the vengeance Western. But then what happens is he says, all right, I hate you people, you killed my wife, it's done, I'm leaving, and I'm gonna like go live in the wilderness and like come and get revenge on you. So again, it seems like pretty standard revenge plot stuff, where he leaves society to become strong and then comes back to do like violence. So remember how I told you that Native Americans are often like a symbol for wilderness in these movies? Yeah, racism's not fun. Well, this movie is no different. So him leaving society actually just means that he's gonna go like live with his in-laws. So yeah, he moves into this Native American village, and eventually he basically discovers that these Native Americans are just as much bastards as the people that he left, because basically they plan to do, I don't remember the specifics, but they're planning to do some like monumental act of violence that is just not acceptable to him, and so he leaves, and the story just kind of ends on this note of like, well, I left society because they sucked, and then I joined with the Native Americans, and yeah, we're really gonna be strong together, and then he discovers that doesn't work either, and he leaves them as well. So this movie does something interesting in that it's kind of toying with the themes, because the idea of the both the classic and the vengeance variation is that society makes you weak, but it's also ultimately worth being a part of society for one reason or another. The hero of this movie rejects that idea. He rejects being a part of society at all, and then goes to live with the Native Americans. But he ends up having to reject that lifestyle as well. So he's not just rejecting society. He's also rejecting the wilderness. And so it's really unclear where this man's going to go after this, because he's rejected one thing and he's rejected its opposite as well. So what's going to happen? And the movie just kind of ends on that uncertainty. So you can see why these movies are a little bit difficult to classify, because they basically just take an existing formula and the whole movie is them just like setting it on fire. So the real question is, what does this mean? What does it mean that for a brief period in the 1970s, films which went out of their way to defy genre conventions were extremely popular? Well, Will Wright argues that basically the reason that this happened is because people were beginning to reject the messages of these Western films. So in order for us to understand why that happened, we need to kind of understand what the message of those films are. So I'm a little rusty on this part, but Will Wright basically argues that these films are answers to the question, how should I live my life? More particularly because of their time period and because they were made in America and were watched by Americans. The question is really, how should I live my life under capitalism? How do I survive capitalism? What should I do? And so for the classical and vengeance variations, there's kind of a pretty clear idea, which is that you need to be separate from other people. You need to being separate from others will make you strong, and it'll give you special talents. That's one of the structural similarities, is that the heroes always have some sort of special talent. It'll make you strong, and and then you can use that strength to become of value to society, and then that's the only real way for you to be accepted and to have power. So there's this kind of contradictory message where you have to be separate from society, and yet it's that precisely that separateness which makes you valuable to society itself. So Wright argues that message worked for a little while, but by the 1970s, we had shifted from a capitalist model to what he calls corporatism. I don't think he means it the same way that like alt-right trolls on the internet mean it, but he calls it corporatism. And basically, his definition of corporatism is that it's a form of capitalism in which the power doesn't belong to workers in general. It mainly belongs to firms of specialized individuals. So like specialized groups of people, people with special skills like engineers and whatever. Whereas previously it had been much easier to make your way as an individual. After about the 1970s, it became necessary to associate yourself with some sort of like elite group of people, some elite profession, something like that. I might be totally botching that explanation because it's been about a month since I read the book, and honestly I didn't understand that section very well. I'll post something in the comments if I like messed it up. Okay, so those are the messages of the first three plots: the classic, the vengeance, and the transition. And the transition is basically a rejection of the classical and the vengeance plots. They're messages about what it is that capitalism is and what it does. So that leaves us with the fourth plot, the fourth subtype of movie, which in my opinion is kind of the darkest one, and it's not a satisfactory answer to the question, to these questions that were raised about like, okay, well maybe this model of life worked under early capitalism, it doesn't work anymore, what do we do now? So the fourth plot is called the professional plot. So this one is structurally different in a couple of very interesting ways. The first one is that in the other plots, the hero was almost always an individual In some cases, it was two people. But almost always, the hero was an individual. In the professional plot, the hero is never an individual. It's always a group of people. So you could consider this a group of heroes. The way that Wright puts it is that the role of hero is shared across several people. So it's not that any individual is a hero, it's that when they're all together, they share the role of hero. And you can see that this is the case in the fact that, for example, one of them might die, and then the hero status continues without them. So these movies are also characterized by a kind of moral ambivalence. The heroes in these films, they don't fight for justice or morality. They always fight for their own self-interest. And the way Wright explains this is that these people have created kind of their own elite society. So they completely reject society, and they form their own society of elite, like special people, that's out over here. And since they don't need society anymore, their loyalties don't have anything to do with society. So they don't have any obligations to society. Their only obligations are to the group. So you'll see in these movies, you'll see basically just like bad people, like bandits, robbers, etc. But they treat each other with kindness, and that's actually universal across all of these films. And what this means is that basically the moral responsibility, the responsibility to morality, has transferred from moral responsibilities to society to moral responsibilities to your compatriots. So the way Wright interprets this is that basically it's a reflection of the kind of proper and effective way to behave under late-ish, like, late 70s, capitalism, which is that you need to find some sort of elite profession that will pay you well, and then your obligations should be to that profession and not to society as a whole. And so an example of this could be like basically just like any profession that has a strong like group identity. You need to find one of those and you need to become a part of it, and it'll give you power. I think there's a lot to say about this, because on the one hand, there's kind of a right-wing version and a left-wing version of that idea, and I think that Western movies are a little bit, hate to say the word, but I'm doing it anyway. They're a little bit problematic, and in a lot of these films, you see professional films, you see such a like moral contempt for the people of society that it seems almost like it seems almost to be like, if you're interpreting it as you need to join an elite group and that group is going to be like separate from the lower tiers of society, it seems almost like a blueprint for fascism, if I can say so. And I think that's pretty frightening that the kind of structure of this genre can appear to be a blueprint for fascism. But I think there's a left-wing version as well, and here I'm kind of just thinking off the top of my head, because this idea of power through strong group solidarity, it reminds me a lot of it comes across almost as a sublimated version of unionism, of you need to find a profession with a strong union, and that's how you're going to survive under capitalism. So yeah, it's very interesting. Awesome. So one last thing. That's the end of the presentation. But one final thing, which is that Wright views these, as I've kind of hinted before, as sequential. So they're not just sequential in the sense that the classical plot is an answer to the question of how do you survive under capitalism, and then the professional plot is an answer to how do you survive under capitalism but 50 years later. He views them as sequential in the sense that they kind of build off of the like symbolic and interpretive groundwork made by previous films. So one way that he talks about this is that in a lot of cases, you can sometimes view the revenge protagonist, the vengeance protagonist, as a completed version of the classical protagonist. Sometimes you can't, but oftentimes you can. So a good example of this from outside of darn, I can't remember what the name of the movie is, but it's the one where it's like the guy's like an assassin, and and he's like retired, but then someone kills his wife, and he's like, I'm gonna kill all of y'all. So that's kind of a good example of what I mean here, where in his backstory, you have a backstory that could be like its own movie almost, and with the way things are going, they probably will eventually make a movie out of that backstory, where he has this whole interesting life of being an assassin, and then the movie starts where the movie that actually got made starts where that hypothetical movie would have ended. And it starts with someone doing something wrong to him. So he's left society to go and do these things, to go and like benefit himself. And then eventually he came back. And then because he grew weak in society, someone was able to do something bad to him, and he had to leave again so that he could get revenge on the people who had done bad things to him. So Wright views Westerns in a kind of similar way, where once you've spent 20 years making basically the same movie, you can move on. You can make a different type of movie. But more interesting than just burning it down and starting again is to make a new genre of movies that builds off of the interpretive language of the first one. So one way you can do this, well, actually the only way that I can think of that you can do this, is basically just to communicate to the audience that, like, yeah, that movie that you've seen like 100 times? Well, this is the movie that starts at the very end of that plot. And so for Will Wright, the vengeance Western is basically, has that relationship to the classical Western. And he views the transitional Western as a rejection. So it's not that it builds off of the classical Western by saying, we're going to start here, we're going to start at the end of this genre, we're going to start where these films normally would end, and we're going to make a whole separate film. He says, we're going to start where these films normally would start, but it's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. So you can read transitional Westerns as failed classical Westerns. It's someone who, or failed vengeance Westerns. It's someone who follows the formula laid out in those genres, and it fails for some reason. So a lot of times the like reason that it fails is very interesting. And this is where you get into critique of the genre, where you can say things like, so in that movie I described of a transitional Western, the reason that it fails to be a vengeance Western is because the hero discovers, basically, and I think this is brilliant, the hero discovers that society basically isn't worth saving. Not only is vengeance not worth doing, but society isn't worth saving. And so they have to ride off into the sunset to discover some new alternative. And I think that's a really interesting way to write any story, really. The only one that serves as a completely new take, a completely new interpretation of the Western, is these professional Westerns. And as I've gone over, I have very mixed feelings about them. They're very good movies, though. Yeah, that's all. So, how do you end a video? Let me know what you think in the comments. This is a new thing for me. I haven't made like a book review / talk about thing, except I guess I did that one other time. Anyway, let me know what you think. If you have like suggestions for books I should read. Somebody left me a book suggestion last time, and that was very nice. I have access to a recording room. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's it. Oh, and let me know what you think is going on in that those vengeance films where the hero like rejects revenge, but the revenge is still like almost it like happens without them anyway. Because I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I have no idea like what that means for the plot, for the genre, for like interpretation of those films. So yeah, let me know what you think of that. Let me know what you think of the video. Let me know what your favorite color is. Is it green? Is it this green screen that I left up and then lazily decided not to actually put anything on? Because that's my favorite color, honestly. All right, bye.